All right, let's dive into this explainer. We're looking at a mind-bending transformation today. How Denmark went from a peaceful, seemingly compliant nation right into a lethal underground resistance during World War II. It's a fascinating shift, isn't it? One that really makes us rethink everything we know about how a country operates under occupation. We're talking about a nation that didn't just fight back with guns, but with shadows, secrets, and an absolutely flawless illusion. And this whole mindset, it's perfectly captured by a British spy named George Alexander Hill. Picture this guy. He had a potato-shaped face, spoke 6 languages, and had this unbelievable talent for blending into foreign cultures. Hill understood something crucial. True espionage, true resistance, literally means hiding in plain sight. You can't just act like a soldier, you have to become a seamless, invisible part of your environment. So that brings us to the core mystery we're unpacking today. How exactly did an entire country manage to mask a deadly resistance movement right under the noses of its occupiers? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at the incredibly unique situation Denmark found itself in at the very start of the war. It's a setup that laid the absolute perfect groundwork for a hidden insurgency.
Section 1. The Model Protectorate.
Denmark's experience back in 1940 was totally unique in Nazi-occupied Europe, and it started with a really uneasy compromise. There was this stark contrast between the grim realities of a world war and the peaceful, dairy-rich facade they called the Cream Front. The Germans actually called it the Sahne Front because of the massive amounts of dairy products and how relatively easy the occupation was for them. Unlike places like Norway or France, the Danish king and the democratically elected government didn't flee. They stayed right in power. Even the Danish police force was still run by Danes. On the surface, everyday life felt, well, surprisingly normal. Now, because those democratically elected leaders were still calling the shots, citizens initially had almost zero motivation to fight. In fact, the government actively discouraged any violent resistance. Why? Because they were terrified of a severe German backlash against civilians. They were basically trying to shield their people by maintaining this really fragile peace. But, as you might guess, beneath that calm, compliant surface, the gears of rebellion were already starting to turn. Section 2. The Underground Awakens. Okay, so this transition from compliance to outright resistance definitely didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, deliberate awakening. While everything looked calm up top, vital work was happening in the shadows. As early as April 1940, Danish military intelligence officers, they called themselves the Princes, were quietly funneling reports to the Allies in London. You had a journalist named Ebbe Munch who set up shop over in Stockholm just to coordinate all these secret communications. And then, when the Germans banned the Danish Communist Party in 1941, the members who managed to escape arrest completely vanished underground. By October 1942, they'd launched a highly organized clandestine press. And here is where things get wild. Look at this staggering daily circulation number, 120,000 copies per day. That was the peak circulation for just one illegal communist newspaper, Land and Folk. To put that into perspective, that massive number proves just how fast the hunger for truth and defiance was spreading like wildfire among the Danish population. The stage was absolutely set for direct action. And it wasn't just seasoned spies and hardcore political operatives getting their hands dirty. Yet even a group of incredibly brave schoolboys in Aalborg, who called themselves the Churchill Club, decided to take matters into their own hands. We're talking about 8 teenagers here. They destroyed German assets with makeshift grenades, literally stole Nazi weapons, and pulled off 25 separate acts of sabotage. The spirit of resistance was taking hold across every single generation. Section 3. The Tipping Point. Eventually, all that growing unrest completely shattered the illusion of the model protectorate. By 1943, we hit a massive escalation. Think of the early years as nonviolent resistance, gathering intel, printing underground papers, all happening under a compliant government. But post-1943, it's a totally different ballgame. We see a hard pivot to violent sabotage, targeted assassinations, and the creation of the Danish Freedom Council, which essentially stepped up as an underground government to coordinate the chaos. Tracking this escalation, August 1943 really stands out as the ultimate breaking point. Acts of sabotage had become so incredibly frequent that the German authorities basically just snapped. They lost all patience, tossed the whole model protectorate idea out the window, and seized full, direct administrative control of the country. The real deciding blow happened when the Germans raided police stations all across Denmark. They disarmed and deported 2,000 Danish police officers straight to Germany.
Now, sure, maybe that made policing easier for the Nazis in the short term, but it spectacularly backfired in the long run. By ripping away the Danish police, citizens suddenly felt zero obligation to protect their once compliant government. That protective buffer was gone, and it fueled an absolute explosion in new resistance recruits.
Section 4. Sabotage and Salvation.
So, with the gloves fully off, the resistance launched operations that were both miraculous in their humanity and utterly devastating in their military impact. Resistance groups like BOPA and Holger Danske were heavily armed, all thanks to the British Special Operations Executive. We're talking over 600 tons of weapons and explosives airdropped in. They used these to completely cripple the Danish railway network right after D-Day, which critically delayed German reinforcements trying to get to France. Plus, you had massive Allied support, like Operation Carthage. That was when RAF Mosquito bombers pulled off a crazy, low-level raid to destroy a Gestapo headquarters right in Copenhagen. Though, tragically, some errant bombs did hit a nearby boarding school, causing heartbreaking civilian casualties.
But this brings us to what is arguably the resistance's most awe-inspiring humanitarian triumph. In 1943, the movement managed to rescue nearly the entirety of Denmark's Jewish population. Over 7,000 Danish Jews were saved from Nazi concentration camps. How? By secretly smuggling them across the sea to neutral Sweden. For this incredible, collective act of salvation, the Danish resistance is still honored today at Yad Vashem.
But right alongside that incredible salvation sits a much, much darker number, 400. That is the estimated number of Danish Nazis, informers, and collaborators who were systematically assassinated by the underground resistance between 1943 and 1945, just to protect their networks.
It's a real narrative whiplash, isn't it? It forces us to just pause and grapple with a deeply uncomfortable piece of history. Going from saving thousands of innocent lives one moment to executing hundreds of local informers the next, it presents a profound moral dilemma. And it's a dilemma that historians and the Danish public have been wrestling with for decades since the war ended.
Section 5. The Moral Cost.
When you really look closely at this legacy in post-war Denmark, you uncover some deep moral ambiguity. See, immediately after the war, politicians defended these liquidations as absolutely necessary acts of war. But modern historical studies have really peeled back the curtain. Authors interviewing veterans found that the decision to kill wasn't always this pristine, heavily debated, committee-led process. Actually, scratch that, it was rarely that. It was often improvised, based on the moment, and incredibly controversial. Take the case of Jane Horney, a Danish citizen killed at sea. Her death really highlights the devastating, morally murky choices these people were forced to make in the fog of a shadow war.
And we absolutely must remember the heavy physical toll paid by the resistance itself. Over 850 members of the Danish resistance lost their lives. They died in action, perished in Nazi concentration camps, or were executed by court-martial. Make no mistake, the price of defiance was extraordinarily high for the people who chose to step up and fight.
So after all of that, what did it actually achieve? Well, historians today generally agree that while the resistance absolutely provided vital intelligence, their direct military impact on the broader war was relatively limited. They didn't liberate the country purely by force of arms, But a British intelligence report concluded something way more profound. The ultimate strategic impact of the Danish resistance was that it salvaged the nation's honor. It restored their national pride and unified a completely broken nation, paving the way for post-war Denmark.
So the biggest takeaway from this explainer is actually summed up perfectly by Field Marshal Montgomery. He famously said Danish military intelligence was second to none. Denmark might have started out as this compliant cream front, but their evolution into a highly effective, albeit morally complex, shadow war left an undeniable mark on history. And it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to end on. When a nation is forced to hide its true character in plain sight, just how far into the shadows must its citizens go to save its soul?